Remembering Norma McCorvey, the woman behind Roe v. Wade who became a pro-life Catholic. We look back at her life, including reaction from Rome. Protesting the Filipino president.
Paano natin ito ipagpapatuloy?
Catholics rally against a deadly crackdown on drug dealers. Presidential survey. The head of C-SPAN reveals what makes a good leader. And how did you become Pope? What the Holy Father had to say after being asked that question by a child. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, February 20th, 2017. Good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. The woman known as Jane Roe in the Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion has died. Norma McCorvey went from being an abortion advocate to a pro-life Catholic. Mark Irons brings us her story from the Supreme Court tonight. Mark?
Wyatt, in 1973, the decision that legalized abortion took place here. It's not something that Norma McCorvey was proud of. In a statement, her family said, quote, though she was the Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, she worked hard for the day when that decision would be reversed. In 1969, Norma McCorvey was 22 years old. Unmarried, unemployed, and pregnant with her third child, she began to hear about abortion.
I really didn't even know what the word abortion meant. I had to go and ask a friend, and she spelled it for me and told me to look it up in the dictionary. I still didn't understand it.
Abortion was illegal in Texas, except to save a mother's life. In her book, I Am Roe, Norma says an adoption attorney put her in touch with Sarah Weddington, a Texas lawyer who was seeking to represent a woman to challenge the state's abortion law. The two met over lunch.
She got taken advantage of over a pizza lunch, basically, to sign some papers, and she didn't think anything of it. I mean, she went on to then have the baby. Sarah Weddington couldn't help her in that short of time and placed the baby for adoption. So she was definitely taken advantage of.
Janet Morana, executive director of Priests for Life, became friends with Norma in the mid-90s. She says the woman known as Roe found out about the 1973 Supreme Court decision in a Dallas newspaper. By that time, she had already given birth to her third child, a daughter, and gave her up for adoption. Norma McCorvey never had an abortion, but her court case legalized abortions across the country.
We forgive you in Jesus' name.
Yes, you are forgiven.
In 1995, Norma was baptized a Christian and made the switch from abortion advocate to pro-life fighter.
We are here to proclaim that Jane Roe is dead and Norma McCorvey lives in Jesus' name.
In 1998, she was confirmed into the Catholic faith, telling the Associated Press that year, I don't believe in abortion even in an extreme situation. If the woman is impregnated by a rapist, it's still a child. You're not to act as your own God. In 2005, the Supreme Court rejected McCorvey's challenge to the Roe v. Wade ruling, but Morana says Norma would hope the pro-life movement can one day reverse the decision.
Just the way she was taken advantage of, she feels like the abortion industry continues to exploit women, and she would like to see stop the killing of the children and stop the exploitation of women, I think.
Norma McCorvey formed her own group, Roe No More Ministry, in 1997. She traveled across the country speaking out against abortions. McCorvey died on Saturday of heart failure. She was in an assisted living center outside of Houston. McCorvey was 69 years old. Wyatt?
Mark Irons reporting from outside the Supreme Court. Thanks, Mark. Joan Lewis, EWTN's Rome Bureau Chief, met Norma McCorvey and heard her story firsthand. Joan now joins us from Rome. Joan, how did you meet Norma McCorvey and what struck you about her?
Well, we met in 2013 when a whole bunch of us were in New York to mark the 20th anniversary of Priests for Life with Father Frank Pavone. And we had 3 or 4 days together sharing meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I heard her entire story from her difficult childhood to the point of course, we have said that she is the Roe of the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 at the Supreme Court that legalized abortion. And her life was very difficult up to that time. She was very young. She was in her third pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy. She was trying to figure out what to do because, of course, abortion was not legal in the States. And these lawyers came along and said they would help her. This is the part of the story that struck me more than anything else in talking to her. These lawyers said they would try and help her through the pregnancy. Well, the long and short of it is she really was deceived, misled by these lawyers. She never had an abortion herself, and she never even went to court. But before she knew it, you've got the Supreme Court case decided, the Supreme Court siding on the side of abortion, and it became illegal. It became legal in 1973. So to see her anguish at something she thought was just going to be lawyers helping her in a personal decision becomes something that affected our entire country, and she lived with that anguish for such a long time.
Joan, what do you think led her to change her mind about abortion and become part of the pro-life movement from a spiritual point of view?
Actually, I'll tell you what it was. Here, she was working to help people with abortions. She was familiar with doctor's offices. She herself was in her third pregnancy. One day, she's in a doctor's office, and she sees a chart on the wall, and it was a fetal development chart. And she looked at it and just like had this epiphany of, oh my gosh, I've had 3 children. I've been there when abortions were taking place, illegal, of course. But she said, all of a sudden, I realized this was human life. Abortion was the deliberate taking of a human life in the womb of a mother. And so when she realized that, she then dedicated the rest of her life to trying to overturn the decision that she had been instrumental in helping the court pass in 1973. So faith became a very big part of her life. She was baptized as an adult. Father Frank Pavone brought her into the Catholic Church, confirmed her in 1998, and then she spent years giving talks and being part of the March for Life, trying to overturn that dreadful Roe v. Wade decision.
It's a pretty profound story after a pretty profound life. Joan Lewis, EWTN's Rome Bureau Chief, thanks so much for talking with us.
Exactly. My pleasure.
President Trump makes a surprise announcement from his Mar-a-Lago resort in South Florida. Army Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster will take over the key role of National Security Advisor. Trump calls McMaster a man of tremendous talent and tremendous experience. McMaster is a career military officer who has been awarded a Purple Heart and the Silver Star, among other honors. The president's acting National Security Advisor, retired Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, will work alongside McMaster as the National Security Council's Chief of Staff. McMaster replaces retired General Michael Flynn. Flynn was ousted last week after reports that he had discussed sanctions with Russia's ambassador to the U.S. before President Trump's inauguration. James Mattis makes an unannounced trip to Iraq for the first time as U.S. Defense Secretary. He arrived in Baghdad early today to become familiar with the situation on the ground. Mattis says the U.S. does not intend to seize Iraqi oil, shifting away from an idea proposed by President Trump. The secretary outlined his goal to take out ISIS, also referred to as Daesh.
By, with, and through our allies is the way this coalition is going against Daesh. We're going to continue to go after them until we destroy them and any kind of belief in the inevitability of their message.
Iraq is driving ISIS out of western Mosul, the terror group's last major stronghold in the country. More than 5,000 U.S. forces remain in Iraq to offer training and assistance. A draft of President Trump's revised travel ban targets the same 7 countries listed in the original executive order. A senior administration official says it would allow travelers who already have a visa to travel to the United States. President Trump says he could sign the revised travel ban sometime this week. Protesters rally against the president's policies on immigration and other key issues. They're calling today's holiday Not My President's Day. Protests took place everywhere from New York to Atlanta and Los Angeles. The president caused some confusion over the weekend, making remarks critical of Sweden's immigration policies and linking them to a rise in crime. President Donald Trump doing damage control following his campaign-style rally in Florida after seemingly suggesting a terror incident occurred in Sweden.
You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden. Who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible.
The comments sparking confusion worldwide. The president later explaining it was something he saw on TV, tweeting, My statement as to what's happening in Sweden was in reference to a story that was broadcast on Fox News concerning immigrants in Sweden. In that report, a conservative filmmaker accused the Swedish government of covering up violent crimes committed by refugees. Swedish officials outraged, the Swedish embassy tweeting, "We look forward to informing the U.S. administration about Swedish immigration and integration policies." The White House telling reporters the president was talking about rising crime in general and not referring to a specific incident. Meanwhile, Vice President Mike Pence trying to reassure allies of America's support for Europe and NATO.
Today it is my privilege on behalf of President Trump to express the strong commitment of the United States to continued cooperation and partnership with the European Union.
Pence also says the United States will stand firm against Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine. A new ceasefire begins today after a recent spike in violence between Russian-backed separatists and Ukrainian armed forces. Pence warned the head of NATO that other countries in the alliance need to boost their defense spending and that President Trump wants to see real progress by the end of the year. Many members are spending less than 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. A retired police officer in the Philippines says President Rodrigo Duterte ordered him and others to kill criminals in the drug trade and paid them for the murders. A human rights lawyer says the allegations could be grounds for impeachment, even though the reported killings took place before Duterte became president, when he was still a mayor. Duterte earlier admitted he killed suspected criminals to show police how it's done. Thousands of Catholics in the Philippines voiced their concern over Duterte's deadly crackdown against illegal drugs. About 10,000 people joined the Walk for Life rally, holding signs reading, "Choose life" and "No to the death penalty." It's the latest sign of the Catholic Church's increasing activism in the country. The trial opens for 47 people charged with attempting to kill the Turkish president during a failed coup. The former soldiers and other conspirators are accused of attacking a hotel where the president was staying. They face life in prison if convicted. Pope Francis prays for the victims of the violent clash in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Continuano purtroppo a giungere notizie di scontri violenti e brutali.
The Holy Father said he feels the pain of the victims, especially the children. Yesterday, he made an appeal for peace in the region and asked for prayers for the victims of war all over the world. Parishioners in a northern Iraqi town hold Mass for the first time since 2014. Telskov is considered safe again now that Kurdish forces were able to push ISIS out. Saturday's Mass was packed. Iraq once had an even larger Christian population, but many fled to get away from the violence. There is a struggle in this age of information overload not to become deaf to the needs of others. Last week, Lauren Ashburn asked a bishop about the best ways to find balance.
Bishop James Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska is in Rome this week and joins us. Your column in the Southern Nebraska Register about this age of noise seems very relevant because here we just lived through 2 years of a very contentious presidential election and the arguments are continuing. What is your advice for coping with what you call the tyranny of the immediate?
The tyranny of the immediate, yes. I mean, it seems like more and more every day we're sort of, our senses are demanded attention to all of the information and noise that comes to us. But I think it goes back to something very simple. St. Teresa of Avila said it, we have to be in the world but not of it. And we are citizens of heaven, and we have to rise above sort of the clatter and chatter of this world, which is really hard because of technology and our devices. But I think people have to be more disciplined maybe than they were before. And we need to have moments, times of disconnectedness. We have to unplug from this whole grid from time to time, especially in our families, and have times where we're in conversation with one another, where we look at each other in the eye, where we have genuine, real human interaction. And if we don't, we're just going to be a frazzled, distracted, superficial, shallow people.
You also said, in the words of St. Paul, we must not be conformed in this world. Yet, as faithful Catholics, we must be engaged in culture and politics. So how do you balance those competing ideas?
This week I celebrated Mass on the altar where Blessed John Henry Newman celebrated his first Mass. And Newman had this wonderful reflection on the invisible world, that we have to realize that we are always to be engaged in this world, and he was very engaged in everything of his day. But at the same time, we have to rise above sort of the clatter of this world. You know, it's a balance. We have to be fully engaged, fully part of the world in which we live. We can't opt out unless we're called to be hermits, some of us are, or to be contemplative cloistered monks or nuns, but most of us aren't.
Thank you so much, Bishop James Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. God bless you.
Coming up, changing human life in a lab. Professor Christopher Tollefson explains the science behind gene editing. And a little later, see the new statue of Pope Francis. All wisdom comes from the Lord and is with him forever. The sands of the sea, the drops of rain, and the days of eternity. Who can count them? The height of heaven, the breadth of the earth, the abyss, and wisdom. Who can search them out? Part of today's reading from the first chapter of Sirach. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. 9 months after the nation's first anesthesia abortion law was enacted in Utah, abortion doctors say they're not following it. The law requires unborn babies to receive anesthesia or painkillers before the abortion if they're past 20 weeks gestation. Doctors at Planned Parenthood in Utah say they haven't changed their abortion procedures because the state hasn't given them specific guidance. We told you last week about the ethical dilemma over gene editing. The National Academies of Sciences and Medicine are focused on treating rare diseases, but they're also opening the door to changing genes we inherit from our parents. Joining us now is Dr. Christopher Tollefson, professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. Chris, can you explain germline gene editing for us?
Sure. Germline gene editing is a technique that takes out short strands of DNA, typically strands with which there's a problem, such as a mutation. It repairs the DNA and then it replaces it. It returns it to the human source.
So scientists say this type of technology, one example is CRISPR, could be used to treat diseases like muscular dystrophy, blindness, even HIV, but it can also be used as gene enhancement, for instance, to create designer babies. So what are the ethical concerns here?
Well, there are a couple of different concerns with that notion of enhancement. One can do enhancement even apart from babies. One could use CRISPR, for instance, to try and make human beings stronger, even at the adult stage. But when we are dealing with human embryos and interventions on human embryos, then the concerns are even stronger. Are we creating a human being for our own purposes? Are we designing it according to our own needs rather than respecting its intrinsic dignity? This is the real problem that we need to think about.
Well, as genetic science becomes more advanced and more complicated, there's a whole host of ethical issues that are at stake become more difficult to navigate. As you imply here, there's more gray area. So what advice do you have to Catholics who support scientific innovation but also want to defend the dignity of human life?
Well, it's important to remember that every technology can be misused, and that's not a reason to deny ourselves the benefits that can come from that technology. CRISPR is probably going to have a great impact on human beings' health. At the same time, we need to be very concerned about the experimental sources or human embryos being used in doing basic research that's leading to CRISPR technology. And we have to be concerned about the objects of that research are human embryos being used in a way that transforms them contrary to their dignity, and especially in the context of in vitro fertilization. We need to be very concerned about that happening.
It is a concerning issue and one that we will continue to follow. It can be a complicated issue with all of the terminology. So Dr. Christopher Tollefson, professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina, thanks so much for breaking it down for us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, what makes a good president? Rob Kennedy joins us with the results of a new presidential survey. And Pope Francis answers an interesting question. Why did the Cardinals pick him? Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. First Lady Melania Trump recited the Lord's Prayer when she introduced her husband at this weekend's rally in Melbourne, Florida.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
After the prayer, the First Lady offered her own pledge to act in the best interest of all Americans. She added she would stay true to herself no matter what the opposition says about her. As the country honors its presidents today, C-SPAN releases its third survey of presidential leadership. The study asks historians and biographers to rank past presidents on 10 attributes of leadership. Lincoln tops the list, followed by George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, and Dwight Eisenhower. Joining us now with a closer look at the findings is Rob Kennedy, the co-CEO of C-SPAN. Rob, this is the third survey you've done, and once again, Abraham Lincoln leads the list. What qualities about Lincoln do you think put him at the top?
Well, our survey is a grouping of 10 different qualifications of presidential leadership. So there's 10 different criteria, and Abraham Lincoln scores high on almost all of them. It's things like crisis leadership, moral authority, pursued equal justice for all of the things that happened during his presidency to help him score high on those particular criteria. And certainly the fact that he was president during one of the biggest crises of our nation, and how he performed, I think, is one of the reasons that he performs at the top.
And consistently, too. When President Barack Obama left office, Gallup poll showed his approval rating was down to about 59%, but your survey has him at number 12, which is pretty high. Were you surprised that he ended up that high, at least in this first round?
I think the interesting thing about President Obama's ratings are how varied they are.
Okay.
He ranks number 3 in pursued equal justice for all. He's very high in moral authority. Some categories he's lower down the list on, for example, relations with Congress, he's number 39. So there's some variability to his rating, but he performs strong on things like economic management, and I think that was one of the reasons that put him up where he ended at number 12. Also interesting to note that President Clinton is now number 15, and President George W. Bush is number 33. But President Clinton and President Bush's ratings have changed over time. That's one of the interesting things about the surveys, is to track how presidents fare over time as their presidencies recede more into history.
Noting that history, are there any lessons that you would give to the current president?
Oh, I don't profess to give him any advice, but it is interesting, and I think this is one of the interesting things about the way we do our survey, is that we have a panel of academic advisors who helped us structure the survey starting in 2000, and we've never changed the way the survey is structured, and it's built around these 10 criteria of presidential leadership. And looking at those, everything, as I mentioned, from moral authority to economic management to pursued equal justice for all, we can look at how different presidents have performed and how they've been rated over time. So I'd say let's just look at all 10 of those criteria for all of our presidents and see how they change over time.
Like you say, it is a fascinating survey, and like you say, to see how presidents fare go up and down over time really is fascinating. Rob Kennedy, co-CEO of C-SPAN, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Wyatt.
It's been 1 year since Pope Francis visited Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and the city is commemorating the historic trip with a statue. The sculpture, which shows the Holy Father holding a dove, was unveiled during a celebration, which also included Mass. The statue is the biggest one built of Pope Francis so far. How was Pope Francis picked to be the leader of the Catholic Church? He says, not by being the most intelligent. During the Holy Father's visit to a parish in Rome, a child asked him how he became Pope. He said the cardinals don't always pick the most intelligent person who's shrewd and able to act quickly. Instead, Pope Francis says the choice is the one who God wants for that moment for the church. Pope Francis asked the children who they thought was the most intelligent cardinal from the 2013 papal conclave. They all shouted, "You." Well, Pope Francis may be pretty humble, but I think we all can agree he's pretty intelligent as well. And we thank you for watching our newscast tonight. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Good night, and God bless.